"We're terminating you effective immediately. Security will escort you out," he said without even looking up from his brand new company-issued MacBook Pro, still halfway through setting up his LinkedIn profile for the first time. The CEO's son. Day one, hour one. Me getting the boot. No handshake, no explanation. Just a trembling junior HR rep standing behind him like she was watching someone defuse a bomb with a butter knife. I'm Andy Henderson, 58 years old, and I'd seen this kind of arrogance before. Back in the Navy, we called it Golden Boy Syndrome. Kids who thought rank came with their last name instead of earning it through sweat and years of getting their hands dirty. But this was different. This wasn't some spoiled midshipman on a training cruise. This was my company. Well, technically speaking. The ink on his onboarding packet was still wet, and he was already playing executioner. Christopher Morrison had his blonde hair styled like he stepped out of a Forbes magazine shoot, his Harvard MBA diploma probably still in the mail, and his confidence inflated like a parade balloon at the Macy's Thanksgiving Day parade. He didn't ask questions. He didn't even blink. Just read the termination notice off his iPad, word for word, like he was ordering coffee at Starbucks. You could tell someone coached him, probably his father or some overpriced consultant who taught him how to disrupt traditional hierarchies and modernize legacy leadership structures. The kind of business school garbage that sounds impressive in PowerPoint presentations, but crumbles the moment it hits real-world corporate politics. I didn't flinch or argue. I stood up slowly, adjusted my jacket, the same navy blazer I'd worn to board meetings for the past 15 years, and handed over my badge with the kind of calm you learn after 30 years of swallowing corporate politics and grinding through boardroom wars. The badge felt lighter than it should have. Funny how a piece of plastic and metal can carry so much weight until the moment you let it go. He thought he was firing me, thought this was his big power move on day one, his chance to show Daddy and the board that he wasn't just another nepotism hire, that he could make the tough decisions and clean house like a real executive. What Christopher Morrison didn't realize was that I'd been preparing for this exact moment for 25 years. All I said was, I want to do this right. Tell your father the board meeting in 4 hours should be interesting. The words hung in the air like smoke from a lit fuse. Christopher barely looked up from his screen, probably already mentally composing his victory tweet or planning his celebration dinner. But I caught the HR rep's eyes widening slightly. Jennifer. Been with the company for 8 years. She knew something was off, even if she couldn't put her finger on what. Then I walked out. Past the silent HR rep, past the security guard who looked more confused than concerned. Hell, Mickey had been working security here since before Christopher was old enough to drive, past the framed photo of the founding family in the lobby. That photo always bothered me. Glossy corporate propaganda showing 3 generations of Morrisons standing in front of our flagship vessel, the Houston Pride. Funny how they managed to leave out the man who actually wrote the bylaws they built their maritime empire on. The lobby felt different as I walked through it. Same marble floors, same reception desk where Patricia had been fielding calls for the past decade, same floor-to-ceiling windows looking out at the Houston skyline. But something had shifted. Maybe it was just me, but the air felt charged like the moment before a thunderstorm when you can taste the electricity. And hey, while I've got you here, if this already feels like the kind of corporate chaos that makes your blood boil, do me a favor, hit that subscribe button and give it a like. Not because I'm begging, I've been kicked out of nicer offices than this one, but because it really helps the team keep uncovering these stories and exposing what really happens behind those glass doors and mahogany conference tables. You'd be surprised how often the person getting fired is the one holding all the cards. Trust me, this story is just getting started. Now, back to our regularly scheduled downfall. 4 hours. That's how long Christopher had between his first firing and his first legal disaster. In that time, I imagine he celebrated. Maybe called his girlfriend to brag about his executive prowess. Maybe posted a victory selfie in his corner office. My old office, if we're being precise about real estate. The one with the view of Buffalo Bayou and the framed photo of the USS Enterprise. A little reminder of where real leadership comes from. Maybe he drafted up a smug little LinkedIn post about bold leadership and making tough calls on day one. Hell, he probably already had the hashtags queued up. Leadership. Next. Chapter. Disruptor, innovation, or whatever buzzword his personal brand consultant told him to sprinkle into his professional persona. like seasoning on overpriced sushi. But while Christopher Morrison was probably sipping champagne from the executive bar and measuring the windows for new curtains, I was 15 minutes down the road at my attorney's office, filing paperwork that had been sitting in a fireproof safe for the better part of 2 decades. The board packet had already gone out by courier. Express delivery, signature required, to every board member, investor, and general counsel tied to Henderson Maritime Holdings. Clause 23B, titled Plainly Emergency Executive Authority Suspension Trigger, buried in the original shareholder agreement like a landmine nobody expected to step on. Written by yours truly, reviewed by legal, signed by every investor who ever thought. But what happens if leadership goes completely rogue? The answer? If an executive is terminated without a formal board vote, and that termination is initiated by a non-equity appointee, well, then that appointee loses all interim authority. The board convenes within the day. Voting power reverts to the majority shareholder, me. Because while Christopher Morrison was probably sipping champagne from the executive bar and measuring the windows for new curtains, I was filing that clause activation, dated, signed, time-stamped, and couriered to every board member, investor, and general counsel tied to Henderson Maritime Holdings. And unlike his welcome packet, mine came with a certified return receipt and enough legal documentation to choke a federal judge. He thought I'd go quietly. What Christopher didn't know was that I never built this company to be seen. I built it to be protected from people exactly like him, entitled, impatient, handed power like it came with the family Wi-Fi password. He wasn't the first Morrison to underestimate me. But he might just be the last. Because by the time his LinkedIn post got halfway drafted, his name had already been flagged in the system as unrecognized executive, no voting rights, pending shareholder review. And his father, the founder, still hadn't seen the packet. But he would. Oh, he would. There's a reason my name doesn't appear in the glossy company brochures or on the About Us page. I was the ghost in the machine, the clause in the contract, the call you made when the boardroom lights were off and the Coast Guard was asking uncomfortable questions about shipping manifests. I never wanted the spotlight. I wanted structure, stability, leverage, and equity. God, the equity. While the Morrisons were naming conference rooms after dead relatives and handing out plaques to people who'd been here 5 fiscal quarters, I was taking payment in percentages, half a point here, a full point there. Equity, not bonuses. Voting shares, not titles. Every time a deal closed or an investor came sniffing around our maritime operations, I negotiated another slice, quietly, efficiently. I didn't play poker. I built the table and printed the cards. It started back when Henderson Maritime was 2 folding chairs, a whiteboard, and a founder who thought compliance was someone else's problem. Nick Morrison was a visionary, sure, the kind who couldn't remember if we'd paid our port fees or if we'd accidentally wired 6 figures to the guy who painted our break room. Classic entrepreneur. Big ideas, bigger blind spots. I stepped in during our 2nd year when the Coast Guard showed up asking about some missing cargo manifests. Nick was ready to lawyer up and fight. I suggested we fix the systems instead, streamlined operations, stabilized cash flow, secured our shipping contracts with the major oil platforms in the Gulf, made us legitimate, made us profitable, made us bulletproof. For my trouble, he offered me a VP title and a corner office with a view of the ship channel. I declined, asked for stock instead. You'd rather own the ceiling than sit under it, he joked, lighting up one of those Cuban cigars he loved so much. Exactly, I said. By year 3, I was sitting on 18%. Not bad for a Navy logistics officer who knew how to read a balance sheet. By year 8, when we landed the ExxonMobil contract and started moving real tonnage through the port of Houston, I was up to 41%. The CFO left in a screaming match over misallocated funds and some creative accounting that would have made Enron blush. I picked up his shares at a deep discount. Divorce is expensive, and Timothy needed cash fast to keep his ex-wife from taking the kids to California. When Nick's brother tried to sue us into oblivion over some offshore shipping disaster that made the evening news for all the wrong reasons, he failed spectacularly. Turns out when you keep meticulous records and follow Coast Guard regulations to the letter, it's hard to prove negligence. After his legal fees mounted into 7 figures, he offered to settle privately. I took his remaining 26% in exchange for a bulletproof NDA and a promise never to leak the family's regulatory nightmare to the maritime trade publications. 67%. That's where I sat, quietly. No fanfare, no parades, just majority ownership, neatly filed in the Delaware registry where Henderson Maritime Holdings was incorporated. And nestled inside that ownership was Clause 23B, a weird little appendix section nobody ever bothered to read because we'd never needed it. Until now. The clause said that if a non-equity executive ever terminated a corporate officer without board approval, all executive powers would be suspended pending shareholder review. It was a clause for emergencies, betrayals, stupidity. I wrote it after Nick's nephew, different nephew, this was back in 2008, tried to fire the entire logistics department during a tantrum over some missing invoices. That kid's maritime career went dark in 48 hours. Lost his merchant marine license and everything. That was the last time anyone touched power they didn't earn. Until Christopher. Because what this Harvard MBA didn't understand, what nobody told him in his overpriced business school seminars about disrupting traditional industries, was that inheriting a title doesn't mean inheriting control. Control isn't gifted. It's not in your last name or on your office nameplate or in your LinkedIn headline. It's in the contracts, in the fine print, in the clause written during a 2 a.m. conference call with a paranoid investor from Boston who wanted to know what would happen if someone's entitled kid got promoted above their competence level. Turns out, it activates exactly like this. One arrogant termination, no board vote, no cause, no process. Just a kid with fresh teeth whitening and a new email signature strutting into my office like he was directing a reboot of Succession, but with ships instead of media empires. He had no clue that by reading that script, he triggered a corporate trapdoor that had been waiting 25 years for someone stupid enough to step on it. Now that clause was live. I didn't just send the activation letter, I sent a full legal packet. Shareholder statements, equity breakdown, archived email approvals, time-stamped documents, notarized copies. I even included Christopher's little termination memo, signed and dated, complete with its grammatical errors and HR witness signature. They'd laugh about that one later. Well, someone would. Because while he was figuring out how to order new office furniture and get his key card upgraded to executive privileges, the board was reading a memo titled Immediate Suspension of Executive Authority, Clause 23B Activation. Christopher was about to learn what real power looks like. And Nick Morrison had no idea his newest family legacy project had just stepped on a landmine with his son's name engraved on the trigger. Somewhere on the 20th floor, in a glass-walled office he hadn't earned and didn't understand, the CEO's son poured himself a glass of celebratory scotch, the kind of bottle they saved for major contract signings or IPO announcements, neither of which were on his horizon. Macallan 18, if I had to guess, Nick's favorite, probably passed down like everything else in that family. He opened it like he'd just conquered Rome, not fired the man who actually built the empire. Took a photo for Instagram, posted it with some caption about making tough decisions on day one and disrupting legacy thinking. The kind of corporate motivational poster nonsense that makes actual business people want to throw their phones into the ship channel. First day, first problem solved, he texted his girlfriend. Time to modernize this place. He kicked off his Italian leather shoes, leaned back in the executive chair like he'd seen in a million stock photos, and opened his laptop to begin drafting a LinkedIn post that would have made any PR professional vomit from secondhand embarrassment. Something about making bold decisions for long-term innovation and bringing maritime logistics into the digital age. He paused halfway through typing, "Leadership is action, not tradition," unaware he was about to lose both. Meanwhile, across Houston, metaphorically and literally, the board members were opening a very different kind of package. One sealed in a fireproof FedEx envelope stamped, "Confidential, Clause 23B, Activation." The courier had arrived 15 minutes prior, handed the packets to executive assistants like they were jury summons, and left without a word. Express delivery to 8 different addresses across Texas, Louisiana, and one unfortunate investor who'd moved to Florida but still held voting shares from the early days. Inside that packet was a 3-inch thick stack of corporate hell. Cover page, Clause 23B Activation, Shareholder Transition Protocol. Subheading, Request for Emergency Board Meeting under Bylaw 8.4. Attached was a signed trigger letter dated that morning, time-stamped at 7:03 a.m., hours before I was ever terminated. I'd been preparing this paperwork since the moment I heard Nick was bringing Christopher on board as Chief Innovation Officer. Call it Navy training, call it paranoia, call it 30 years of watching entitled kids crash and burn in corporate America. I saw this coming from a nautical mile away. Accompanying the trigger letter, complete equity breakdown, every share I'd acquired over 30 years, every transaction, every co-signed agreement, a full portfolio ledger with notarizations and verified filings, Delaware corporate records, SEC documentation, even the original napkin where Nick and I first sketched out the profit-sharing arrangement back in 1998, properly witnessed and filed with our corporate counsel. The reaction wasn't instant. It was worse. It was that slow, creeping kind of dread when you realize you're not just in trouble, you're in litigation, and you just hadn't checked your email yet. By the time Nick Morrison's personal counsel skimmed the clause and hit the key phrase suspension of executive authority upon unilateral termination by non-equity appointee, he actually said out loud, "Oh no." Then again quieter, "Oh no." The packet also included a meeting mandate. The board was legally required to convene within 4 hours. That timer had already started. I made sure of that. I didn't need to be in the building. The law was, the contracts were. And by the time Christopher's celebratory Instagram story went live, scotch on deck, first executive decision made with a boomerang of clinking glasses, his name was already flagged in DocuSign and LegalZoom logs as the sole initiator of a termination he had no authority to make. Meanwhile, across the city and in 2 time zones, the board members were canceling golf games, skipping client dinners, and calling their assistants to reschedule quarterly reviews. They weren't happy. They were trapped. Because once Clause 23B activates, it's not about office politics anymore. It's about fiduciary duty, voting rights, SEC exposure, their personal assets, their names on filings they never reviewed. This wasn't some family spat over Thanksgiving dinner. This was a legally binding reversion of control that could cost them their board seats, their reputations, and their professional liability insurance. And there, in black and white, was the number they hadn't thought about in years. 67% majority shareholder voting control. Clause trigger. Emergency recall of all executive appointments made in the last 48 hours. Immediate revocation of non-board sanctioned authority. My authority reinstated the moment his was voided. Oh, and let's not forget the cherry on top. The clause wasn't just real, it was irreversible once filed. That little fact had been added during a very specific investor scare back in 2009 when the maritime industry was getting hammered by federal regulations and everyone was paranoid about hostile takeovers. They wanted assurance that if someone did go rogue, they couldn't undo the emergency meeting with a panicked apology and a retracted memo. There was no take-back button, no undo function, no corporate Control-Z. So while Christopher strutted through the hallway with his little clipboard, trying to figure out how to access the internal financial systems, the boardroom chairs were already being filled. Nick hadn't arrived yet, but his phone had buzzed 3 times, and each time he'd ignored the screen. The 4th time he picked up, and everything changed. Nick Morrison was mid-backswing on hole 7 at the Houston Country Club, chewing a cigar that matched his tan and his ego when the first call came in. Ignored. Second one, too. It wasn't until the 3rd ring, persistent, sharp, from his general counsel's personal line, that he grunted, dropped the club, and snapped, "This better be good." What followed wasn't good. It wasn't even bad. It was catastrophic. "I need you back at headquarters," the voice on the other end said. Kenneth Williams, the lawyer who'd been cleaning up Morrison family messes for 15 years. His voice had that particular strain you only hear when someone's about to deliver news that ruins your entire decade. "Right now." "What? Why?" Nick barked, already knowing he didn't want to hear the answer. "Your son signed something. You need to hear this in person." Click. He didn't finish the round, didn't tip the caddy, didn't change out of his golf cleats, just stormed to his Escalade and made it back to the office in under 20 minutes. An Olympic record for someone who usually required 2 assistants and a valet just to get through the front door without stopping for handshakes and photo ops. When he arrived, legal was waiting. So was Timothy, the CFO who'd seen enough corporate disasters to recognize the smell of one brewing, one trembling assistant, and a half-full conference room where nobody was smiling anymore. The kind of silence you get in hospital waiting rooms and federal courthouses. Kenneth Williams didn't waste time with pleasantries. Just opened a leather folder, took a breath like a man preparing to deliver a terminal diagnosis, and read, per Clause 23B of the amended shareholder agreement, any executive termination carried out by a non-equity appointee without prior board vote shall result in immediate revocation of all interim leadership authority, suspension of executive appointments made within the past 48 hours, and automatic deferment of executive control to the majority shareholder pending emergency board review. Nick froze for a second. He looked like he hadn't heard English. Then his jaw clenched, his temples pulsed, and he growled, "Who signed the termination?" No one answered. The silence stretched like taffy. He asked again, louder, more desperate. "Who the hell signed the termination?" Timothy swallowed hard, eyes flicking to the junior assistant who looked like she might vomit into her tablet. Finally, Kenneth responded, flat and unforgiving. "Your son, Christopher, alone." The silence in that room was surgical. Nick blinked once, slowly, then again. The color drained from his face like someone had pulled a plug behind his ears. 20 years of building this company, turning Henderson Maritime from a two-boat operation into a Gulf Coast powerhouse, and his own son had just handed it back to the man who really owned it. He doesn't have sign-off authority, Nick said, as if saying it out loud could somehow roll back the clock and undo the last 4 hours of his life. "No," Kenneth said, "he doesn't. He never did. He was appointed Chief Innovation Officer by you, ratified by the board, and he holds zero equity. His authority is entirely derivative, which means under Clause 23B, his unilateral termination of a corporate officer is invalid and illegal." Nick ran a hand over his mouth, pacing like a caged animal, muttering under his breath, "Jesus, Jesus Christ." Then louder, "This is a misunderstanding. I'll talk to him. We'll rescind it." Kenneth didn't let him finish. "There is no rescind. The clause is live. It's been triggered. Paperwork was filed before the termination was executed, time-stamped, notarized, and distributed to all investors. You've got 90 minutes left before the emergency meeting begins." "But he's my son," Nick tried, the words coming out like a plea. "He's not a shareholding family member," Kenneth cut in. "And right now he's sitting in Andy Henderson's office drinking your good scotch and asking the IT department how to change the company mission statement." Nick sat down hard, like the chair had punched him. His hands were shaking. No longer the swaggering patriarch of a $500 million maritime empire, just an aging man who realized he'd handed a loaded gun to someone who thought the safety was optional. "Where is Andy?" he asked, voice barely audible. "Probably writing his acceptance speech," Timothy muttered. Nick looked up, eyes red. "What do we do now?" Kenneth closed the folder. "You sit in that boardroom. You listen. You do not interrupt. And when he walks in, because he will walk in, you remember that Andy Henderson holds 67% of this company." "God help us all," Nick said, mostly to himself. At exactly 2:59 p.m., the boardroom door handle turned. Slow, deliberate. You could feel the room tense like a live wire. Nobody spoke. Even Christopher, who'd been summoned from his office celebration, stopped scrolling through his phone. I walked in at 3:00 on the dot. No rush, no fanfare. I wore the same navy suit they'd seen me in 1,000 times before, tailored like a uniform, not flashy, not loud, but unmistakably mine. The kind of presence that didn't need introduction or explanation. I didn't smile, didn't nod, didn't ask permission. I walked straight to the head of the table, the seat Nick hadn't touched since the clause landed like a depth charge, and placed a leather folder in front of me. I didn't sit. I opened it and read. My voice was calm, not theatrical, not emotional, just fact. As majority shareholder, I said, I formally request a binding vote to rescind all executive appointments made in the past 48 hours, pending shareholder review. The words hit like hammers on steel. No reaction at first, just silence, as if the room had forgotten how to breathe. Then the board chair cleared his throat. Motion received, logged, and entered into record for immediate consideration. Christopher looked like he might faint. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. His hands, so steady hours earlier when he signed a firing memo with a signature that meant nothing now, trembled around the edges of his legal pad. And still, I didn't speak. Nobody did. Because there it was, written, spoken, witnessed. A reminder that I hadn't lost control when I was escorted out. I had given them the illusion of it. They thought I'd walk away. They thought the badge meant power. But I wasn't an employee. I was the owner. And this was my reminder. The lawyer confirmed the filing. Clause 23B empowers majority shareholder authority to override interim executive decisions pending board verification. A vote may proceed. The board chair nodded gravely. Motion is live. All in favor of rescinding Christopher Morrison's appointment as Chief Innovation Officer? 8 hands went up. No hesitation, no discussion needed. Motion carries unanimously. Christopher's face went white as printer paper. Wait, you can't just... Security, I said quietly. Not loud, not theatrical. Just fact. 2 guards appeared at the door like they'd been waiting in the wings. Mickey, the same guy who'd escorted me out that morning, gave me a small nod. Professional respect between working men. Christopher Morrison, Mickey said gently. I need your badge, company phone, and office keys. The Harvard MBA looked around the room like someone might save him. His father stared at the table. The board members studied their papers. Nobody met his eyes. He fumbled with his badge, hands shaking. This is my family's company. No, I said, finally taking my seat at the head of the table. This is my company. Your family just worked here. The next morning, I walked into Henderson Maritime Holdings as executive chairman. Same building, same Houston skyline outside the windows, but everything had changed. The company was back where it belonged, in the hands of someone who understood that power isn't inherited. It's earned, one contract at a time, one smart decision at a time, one carefully written clause at a time. Christopher Morrison's LinkedIn went dark within 48 hours. Some lessons you only get to learn once. As for me, I had work to do, ships to move, contracts to honor, and a company to run the right way. Thanks for staying with this story. Hit that subscribe button if you want to see more tales of what happens when preparation meets opportunity. Trust me, there are plenty more where this came from.